Good evening. This is broadcast number 584. It's February the 14th, 1983. It's Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California, KAZUFM. The disclaimer that I make personally, and we have a cart that goes on before the program, is that I am responsible for the content of this material. It is my research, and I have sources of information from which I draw various conclusions and quote directly from articles and books. The station is never responsible for anything that I put on the air or write. I am on the air to express the research that I've done for 20 years, and I stand by it now and forever. And I have never incurred lawsuits, and I don't think I ever would. I wouldn't be afraid of them if I did, and I don't invite them. But I can back up the charges and the allegations I make, and therefore I'm responsible for everything I say. There was a very nice article in a Santa Cruz newspaper, City on a Hill, the University of California newspaper from Santa Cruz. It's the January 20th issue, volume 16. It's by Serena Herr, Herr, titled Worldwide Conspiracy, Mae Brussell Puts the Pieces Together. It's a very well-written article. It goes into my feelings about the people controlling our lives and how these various elements merge together. There isn't much you can put in 2 or 3 pages, but it's a concise, good article, and I appreciate the interview because it's an honest interview, and if any of you live in the area or want to order one from me, you can get it. It's always good to update the opinions that I've had and see them printed because they're not far different than the ones I was saying quite a few years ago, and every week more evidence comes in to support the original allegations, not that I needed more evidence. The news is literally gushing in. I've done research 20 years. There are many, many subjects that I would like to share with you. An example of the amount of news coming is that I filled approximately 275 manila folders with important articles or stories that eventually I hope to share, but those were just from the past few weeks. And if you bear with me, I may not have them on the air right away, but we will discuss them in time, hopefully, because they are very important. New information about my earlier research, opening new doors, and confirming the earlier work and adding to some of the material that we've had on the earlier broadcasts. One example is the Wall Street Journal article, the February the 11th, 1983, just last week, a front-page story and the full half-page inside on the Munich Olympic Games, and it mentions Henry Kissinger and Bashir Gemayel and the PLO and a murder of a participant or arranger of the Munich Olympic Games who was killed by an Israeli in 1979. Now, the interesting thing about this article, bringing in Henry Kissinger, the CIA, Gemayel, and the PLO, and all working together, our government, as well as the radical PLO group, is that the Wall Street Journal didn't give any reason for putting it there. I've done many broadcasts that the Olympic Games was set up by the CIA and by Germans and by the radical PLO that is funded by our CIA, but the Wall Street Journal carries what is allegedly or supposedly the economic stories in Nugan Bank, the Banco Ambrosiano, and so forth, but out of nowhere was this article placed about the various conspiratorial elements of the Olympic Games, and I will carefully outline that and share it with you soon. They also had December 30th a large article on the Opus Dei. There's been a lot of articles about the Catholic organization, the Opus Dei. They only surfaced after Roberta Calvi was murdered in London in June '82. It's an organization that's been going on since 1928 with tremendous power, but again, the Wall Street Journal is carrying stories on the Opus Dei. The conservative newsletter, The Reaper, with Mr. McMaster out of Arizona, had a long story about Martin Bormann and the book by Mr. Paul Manning, Mormon, Nazi, and Exile, and about I.G. Farben. Now, the economic newsletters have not taken in account, up to this point, the massive bank robberies, such as the one in Spain of $15 million, and the people arrested this last week in London are linked to the Bologna bombing, to the Nazis in South America, to international terrorism. The bank robberies were covered simply as bank robberies, but never made the Nazi connections, the gun running, the narcotic, to Klaus Barbie, to Licio Gelli in Italy, who fled at the time of the P2 scandal. Now, all of a sudden, Mr. McMaster has a section in his newsletter, the economic newsletter that was sent to me by a subscriber in San Francisco, in the Reaper. And the question is asked by McMaster when he talks about Martin Bormann and the network of crime, mafia, drugs, and Nazis. He asked, where was my formal education in the school system? Now, that was a very important question for somebody isolated in the economic questions, but not making the questions to the German bank. So this is a big step forward. There was an arrest in France this week of a Nazi, the head of Le Figaro, the newspaper, André Audinot. That also was in the Wall Street Journal. They were planning a Nazi coup in France, just as Licio Gelli was doing in Italy, and very few people in the United States are aware or even think that this coup possibly took place in this country, in Dallas. And what we're getting up is the clinging up of the coup, and all you need is the armband and the swastika and the black boots, and it will be finalized. This country has been in tremendous trouble. France and Italy almost fell to the goose-stepping Gestapo Nazis, and they've made some arrests in France as they have in Italy. Also coming out of South America, I got a copy of an interview with Paul Manning on the Odessa in Argentina, and this was translated by a subscriber to the tapes, a long friend, who sent me a copy of this article from South America, the Odessa in Argentina, talking about Juan Perón, the Nazi treasures, the passports written by the Vatican, Joseph Mengeles, the German submarines, and Martin Bormann. And I will detail this and get into that with you. But again, these are very important stories that we'll have to catch up on eventually. There are some good books out now. Paul Manning's book on Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, John Loftus's book on the Belarusa Secret, and Charles Hyam's book, Trading with the Enemy. If you read those three books, and they're current now, you will get an overview of what happened to this country, what is happening to this country, and the events that you see in the news, such as the arrest of Klaus Barbie, fit into the context of these books. I might mention them every week because they're terribly important to buy and read, and if you can't afford them, get them at the library. I will go later into the implications of the arrest of Klaus Barbie. He's very subtle. He says, let me forget about it. There's been worse crimes since that happened, which is true. And he's nonchalant about the past. He says, forget the past. He can speak because his agents, Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger and Reinhard Gehlen, have committed atrocities since World War II in Iran, in Vietnam, in South Korea, and the Philippines. We have had 100 wars that he mentions, and he's very nonchalant. How can you get excited about me? And I was going into Klaus Barbie and the people who covered up his crimes and a lot of implications of him in particular. They're also top Nazis, and many articles now, besides of Barbie in Chile, there's Walter Rauff. In Argentina, there's Mr. Kurtzmann, Kutzschmann. In Paraguay, there's Joseph Mengele, Mengeles. And in Syria, there's Mr. Brenner, Brunner, Alois Brenner, that's his first name, Alois, top Nazi who's worked with the CIA. All these people have worked with the United States government since before the war was over up till today and tomorrow until they're caught. One top Nazi in Brazil that was recognized at the time of Hitler's birthday party, Mr. Wagner, went to the police. He died, allegedly a suicide, about 2 years ago. He's through. There are top Nazis in every major country, and many articles are surfacing, and I have articles on each one of these and where they are now and in the news, and we'll go into those stories within time. Another subject that is very complicated, that takes a lot of time, Ted Rubenstein is providing marvelous research. David Emery up at the Bay Area is working this, and their writers on the East Coast and myself working on I call it an octopus because there's the body politic and then the proms and legs, only this is like a 9-part body, and I don't want to confuse you. I want to break down the sections that are in the news now, and each week I'll take, or most every week, I'll take a part of the news that's gushing out because it's too confusing to jump around. It has to do with the combination of the Vatican, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Pentagon, the mafia and narcotics, and gun running. Now, those are 4 subjects that interweave like a ballet. They're in the news every single day, and particularly the European newspapers, not so much here. First, number one, is the Banco Ambrosiano, the largest bank in Italy that collapsed, the murder of the president of the bank, Roberto Calvi. He also worked with the Vatican Bank, so that the Banco Ambrosiano in Italy is one of the prongs of the scandal. And also later the big drug arrests of millions of dollars and the gun-running headquarters of a world mafia organization is right in the office of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan. The Banco Ambrosiano, Roberto Calvi, is one subject under which I have maybe 20 or 30 major stories that we will be sharing, that part of it. The second part is the Vatican Bank, the IOR, the Institute for Religious Works. A new story came out just yesterday morning on the scandal of that bank. The Pope, the Polish Pope, has been directly involved in sending Italian tax money and gasoline money down to the Argentine Nazis and in Peru and Uruguay and Nicaragua, so that the church is tangled into the civilian part of fascism that is heavily funded. The Vatican Bank is related to the Banco Ambrosiano and Roberto Calvi. Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, would be arrested. He is hiding inside the Vatican since June. I want to update that with you. And two of the leaders of the Vatican Bank were arrested, the second man under Marcinkus, just yesterday, having to do with 1.1 billion of gasoline taxes, which the Vatican, a Polish pope, took Italian tax money and put it to the Nazis in South America and also in Poland. Now that is important because he worked for I.G. Farben, and in the book, Paul Manning's book on Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, it goes under the 750 corporations of I.G. Farben that are strangling the world, that are the Nazi Odessa network. So you have the Banco Ambrosiano segment with 20 or 30 major stories right now I've laid out. And the Vatican Bank, the IOR, the Institute for Religious Works. Now, a third segment of this are the drug arrests taking place in Milan currently, in Lebanon, in London, and those links to the Vatican Bank and to Banco Ambrosiano. None of these are separate, but they're carried as separate stories. But in the stories, the names of the people make connections. So you have the major drug arrests, and the drug arrests are linked to the right-wing terrorist groups, the drug traffic, such as the bombing of Bologna, where over 80 people were murders, and links to the Nazis. The Nazis are into cocaine and the Lebanon drugs, the South American drugs, and Southeast Asian. And they're funding the left, funding the right, and making it look like the left are the terrorists. One example was Licio Gelli, who fled the country, who was putting the Nazi administration and Mussolini's group he worked with, Mussolini as head of the equivalent of the Gestapo. His daughter was arrested after Gelli fled the country, and in her possession were instructions from the American General Westmoreland on terror and just soft kind of terrorism, suggesting, the General Dozier, the NATO kidnapping, which was a fake, similar to the SLA in this country or the Manson family, the alleged left or crazies funded by the right for specific purposes. So there are major drug arrests in Los Angeles at the current time, in Florida, in Milan, in London, in Lebanon, and they tie directly to the Vatican Bank and the Banco Ambrosiano, the largest bank of Italy, and the Vatican Bank. Then the gun running is the fourth part of this octopus. And the gun runners, some of them are being identified in London and in Milan and in Monte Carlo, tying directly into the CIA, to the Mafia, to the Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Nazis, all those Nazis that I listed that are down in South America, the gun running, and the drugs pay for the guns, and they supply these terrorist group that will be surfacing very quickly and united under one organization. Then a separate section is the murders directed and related to all of this. There are continuous death squads I mentioned before in South America, in France, in Italy, in the United States, all over the world. And these death squads, I'm filling just files of folders just for the past few weeks, not going back in for the last few years, these death squads, but current people that are dying. And I'll give you an example of several of those in the news. I could just spend a whole evening on them, and I will do some of those. And those murders or the shootings are directly linked to the Lebanon narcotics, to the Milan mafia, to the London connections, to the Vatican Bank and the Italian Banco Ambrosiano. Then there are the bank robberies. Now, the great train robbery was arranged in Great Britain by Otto Skorzeny, and the men went down to Brazil and took large amounts of money. The bank robbery at Nice, when the safes were broken in, was Nazi money, and they were the moles that went under there and took large amounts of money. There was a bank robbery in Spain. The men, some of them were arrested in London. They're linked again to Klaus Barbie, to the bombing, the Bologna bombing, to murders of policemen. The bank robberies that are surfacing now linked to the various murders, to the gun running, to the drugs, the Vatican Bank, and the Banco Ambrosiano. Now, another series of articles that is important is that while all of this is going on, the Polish Pope, the Auschwitz Pope, has recognized Malta. He's giving them status. He elevated the Opus Dei because those are the financial wizards with an oath to poverty and so forth, the world bankers and the monarchies, getting him out of his debts or trying to help him. He has knighted Alexander Haig, as I said last week. They have promoted Helene von Damm to the ambassador of Vienna. She worked under Otto von Bolschwing, Eichmann's superior. This week, as soon as she was officially appointed, she went off with her husband, Byron Leeds, and she's dancing in Vienna, the social section of the newspaper Dancing in Vienna. And Herman Abst of IG Farben was put in the bank with the Vatican finances in his hands. So while these scandals are going on, these very high-level scandals of the murders, the drug running, the bank collapsing, the murder of the bank president, Roberta Calvi, and which is all just about acknowledged was not a suicide. Then the other element that's into this is the plans to kill the Pope, and I went into that a little bit with the NBC story, the Bulgarian connections, trying to make the murder or the attempted murder of the Pope an act of war, probably to cover up what has been investigated for 2 years. For 2 years they've been looking into the drug connections in Milan and Rome and Genoa and Palermo and London, and they come back to Banco Ambrosiano and back to the Vatican. Now, what better way than to kill the Pope? One way to get rid of him and call it an act of war. He's a Polish Pope, and blame the KGB. So there are many articles on the people who are being investigated for trying to kill the Pope. Now, you hear about the Bulgarian connection, but there are articles of names that you probably don't know. One is Sergei Antonov. That is the Bulgarian who works at the airport in Rome for the offices there. His name is Sergei Antonov. But there are other names. Omar Bagel was arrested in Switzerland. He belongs to the right-wing Grey Wolves, the Nazi group, Bagel. Another one is Musar Serdar Celebi, Musar Celebi. He's a fascist leader with contacts to Aja. Bekir, Bekar Selenik, Celenk, was arrested in London. He's part of the right-wing fascist group. Oral Selik, that's his brother, Celk, is in West Germany. He is part of the fascist group and allegedly was the gunman who killed the reporter in Turkey when Aja was charged with that murder, and then Aja was allowed to leave the country. There's a Gerard Donovan who has an alias that's almost like Dozier, Douziear, with Australian and Iranian passports that's involved with the shooting of the Pope. It seems that this was a high-level operation, and while we're hearing about the Bulgarian connections, the newspapers from London and from Italy, London Observer, the London Times, are carrying stories, which I get those papers, and there's more that Ted Rubenstein is getting for us from Europe, that bring these other names in. Mr. Horst Grillmayer, Grillmayer, was the Austrian who supplied the weapon for Ajar. And Ruzi Nazar, Nazar, is a Soviet defector that worked with the CIA, the right-wing fascist group, lives in Bonn, and he was the contact for Ajah when he was in Germany. A Mustafa Savak, S-A-V-A-K, a Turkish citizen charged with plans to kill the Pope next May. 2 men have been arrested with plans to kill the Pope in May of 1983 when he goes to Milan. Well, another man, Abu Zer Urgula, U-G-U-R-L-U, supplied the money for Ajah. He's part of the mafia from Istanbul, gun-running, dope, and narcotics, called the Godfather. So I'm giving you, you won't remember these names, but the point is that there are stories on all of these people. Each day somebody's being arrested, somebody who's linked to the Nazis, the mafia, the Vatican, drug connections in Milan, in Genoa, so that this is a very complicated script because of the various elements of the news and their interrelationship. When I see an article on Banco Ambrosiano and it mentions the Vatican, I have to cross-file it under Vatican Bank. If you see an article on the drug bust and it mentions the Vatican or Ambrosiano, then you cross-file and put in the other. So what it involves is having, several hundred manila folders and copying the articles and cross-filing into their separate sections. And then there's another scandal going on, which I will detail later for you, on the Vatican art scandal. Now, this has to do with paintings from Italy that came out of the Vatican to the Vatican emissary at the United Nations. It involves taking oil paintings from the Vatican through the United Nations to places like the John Paul Getty Museum or through the Borghese family, which linked right to Permindex and the original team that killed John Kennedy. These people all have a history going back to that era, and that's why they're so important in the news now. Now, at a meeting in New York City with the Vatican emissary to the United Nations was the top U.S. mafiosa of New York, sitting there with Roberta Calvi, just weeks before Roberta Calvi was murdered. So here is God's banker, president of the Banco Ambrosiano in Italy. He represents the Vatican Bank with their investments. He is funded and supplied by the notorious secret fascist Opus Dei. He's sitting with the top mafiosa in the United States, using oil paintings that have been sent here and involved in tremendous scandals of siphoning paintings out of Europe. Goodness knows where they all go. Now, when the Abscam arrest took place several years ago in February, 2 years ago, the beginning of the investigation had to do with oil paintings that were taken, and it had to do with paintings from the Vatican. And there's a book by William Taub that I did radio programs on called Forces of Power that had to do with the Teamsters, the mobsters, Jimmy Hoffa, paintings of Rubens, stolen art, and the Vatican. After the 2 New York Times writers, Maitland and Bloom, Howard Bloom, who wrote Wanted Search for the Nazis, after the Abscam story began looking for paintings that were in this country, and there was this scandal of the mafia, the Vatican, and oil paintings, the quick diversionary of Abscam went completely away from those oil paintings. And I had mentioned the oil paintings on the air one broadcast. The next week, the Abscam story broke and had to do with oil paintings, and then it disappeared. Well, in the news in the last month, there have been many stories about the oil paintings and the Vatican and the mafia and Roberta Calvi, so that these stories all tie together. They are related to each other, and the trick now is to take the individual articles and cross-file them into the various categories and come out with a clear picture of the top Nazis involved, the countries involved, the drug connections, the murders, the role of the Vatican, the current Pope, and the banking collapses and the siphoning out of France and out of Italy, the money that the people should have had from their gas taxes to fund the worldwide Nazi organizations. And there are many good articles, biographies, right out now, long stories on Licio Gelli, on Roberta Calvi, one in the London Times or the Observer, I forget where the money went, a detailed account of where the money went, that 1.2 billion that has not been retrieved, and a long story from Fortune on Michael Sindona, written in it was written the year before Watergate, before the collapse of his bank, 1973, the year before the Franklin National Bank. Sindona had a lawyer named Richard Nixon. He had built the Watergate Hotel. He was deeply involved with the Dominican Republic, with Gulf and Western, with all the top organized crime families in Italy, particularly the Gambino family, and with Licio Gelli, who had served Franco and Mussolini, fled to Argentina, then came back to Italy with his organizations to overthrow Italy and put it in a fascist country. He was God's banker, Michael Sindona, before Roberta Calvi took over when Sindona's bank collapsed, the Franklin National Bank that he invested in the New York City area. Now, I'll mention a couple of murders examples. I'm not going to do a whole program on the murders involved here, but a listener to World Watchers took attention. I asked, where is Shlomo Argov, Shlomo Argov? Where is he now? He was the alleged excuse, if they needed one, for Israel and Mr. Sharon to go into Lebanon. And he was the Israeli ambassador to Great Britain, who was gunned down in June 1982, just about 2 weeks before Roberta Calvi was hung in England. He was an important person in Middle Eastern affairs, and he was shot, and there was never a word or a picture about him afterwards. And I received an article that was in Near East Report, Washington Weekly, article February the 4th, 1983, Shlomo Argov, the Israeli ambassador to Britain, a victim of an attempted assassination on the eve of the war in Lebanon, is almost completely paralyzed and almost totally blind, according to the Jerusalem hospital. He's in Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. He was shot in the head. He has recovered intellectual capability. He's aware of his surroundings. From time to time, he has agonizing pain. He's unable to talk, and he barely recognizes those who call on him. So he was literally left a vegetable. Now, one article on when he was gunned down from the Washington Post mentioned the fact that the PLO did not shoot him. The Lebanese Revolutionary Armed Faction claimed credit, the same people that bombed the Israeli embassy in Paris that March and killed a U.S. embassy attaché in Paris, Charles Ray, in January. This group works in Beirut, Lebanon. They're the Lebanese Revolutionary Armed Faction and not the PLO. Now, Mr. Sharon is still funding the Christian Phalange in Lebanon, even though he allegedly stepped down as head of the Defense Department. But one of the excuses for going into Lebanon, which was, I'm sure, planned long in advance, was triggered by the shooting of Mr. Argov, A-R-G-O-V. But after he was shot, he, for all purposes, had disappeared from the scene, and he is in a hospital. He's alive, but not much alive. That's where he is. He was the excuse, but it does not explain who shot him. And after all this damage, I haven't read, and maybe you can follow up for me, if there was ever a trial or an expose of who did this. Or were these Mr. Sharon's Lebanese army, the same people that later gunned down the PLO in Lebanon? Were these Sharon's people knocking down this man? Was he knocked out by his own team? And if not, where is the trial and why the silence? I haven't read a word about this since this happened to him. Now, the minute he was shot, 3 people were apprehended, so it wasn't hard to figure out who did it. They were on the spot. 1 was caught on the spot, and 2 were followed and immediately taken. So I haven't read any trial of these 3, either in London or anywhere else, and the silence also is something to note, to ask about. Another death that's related to this subject, an example, just 1 minute I'll discuss it, was in the San Diego Union, January the 3rd, 1983. Ted Rubenstein found this slain recluse had drawn attention as a possible link in papal attack. Now, on May 24th, 1982, that was a year and a half ago, I talked about the assassination attempt on John Paul II and mentioned Walter Persich Jr., P-F-E-R-S-I-C-H Jr., leader of the National Fascist Party in America, who got money for his shenanigans from the San Diego Trust Savings Bank and from American Express. Well, he had his throat cut this last week. He was mentioned in terms of John Paul II and would be the fascist connection. At the time, they're trying to pull a Bulgarian connection. This fellow was a lover of Franco. He moved to Europe. He lived there in Spain from 1964 to 1972. He went back from 73 to 75. He adored Franco. The newspaper account after he died said he was the only member of the American National Fascist Party But how was it they had the banks and the sources of information and what were his contacts in San Diego and California? We don't know the full story about him, but this is one example at a time, as I say, when they're trying to make a Bulgarian story. The international fascist, the fellow whose name was in the news originally, had his throat cut in bed. We'll take a 1-minute break now on this broadcast and then continue with the second half hour in 1 minute. Now we'll continue with this broadcast. This is Mae Brussell, broadcast number 584. I get those numbers off sometimes, so you have to watch me. And it's side 2. This broadcast is tape recorded live off the air. I don't play the tapes, but it is side 2 on that broadcast. And this is Valentine's Day, February the 14th, 1983. Now I'm going to an article which is very important, which lays the groundwork for all of that past news that's gushing out. And I was only giving you a few articles, just a fraction of the news of this past week. I'm going into an article, Harper's Magazine, February 1983. The book works here in Pacific Grove, has about 10 copies available if you live here and want to buy it. If you are not in the local area and can't find it, I have copied the article and I'll send it to you. It's about 10 pages. The postage, whatever the costs are for printing it and postage, I'll add it up and send you copies of the article, or you can go to your library. It's about a very most important man in America. There are a few biggies in this country, and their names should be known to you because these people, I believe, caused all the pain and horror of what you're reading in your newspapers now of the past and what will be the future. I think the most important names that I have come across in my research are Herbert Hoover, Henry Stimson, Raymond Donovan, Allen Dulles, and John Foster Dulles, the brothers, John J. McCloy. And I'm going to talk about John J. McCloy because he is so important. And this article gives you, it's not a critical article, but it gives you an overview of who John J. McCloy is, and then you can get an idea. I think you'll agree with me on the importance of this man. And I'm going to give you some highlights. The article begins by saying he's the most influential private citizen in America. The article was written by Alan Brinkley, Brinkley. He describes him as relatively unknown. Few know his name. Few know his face. For 40 years, he's remained relatively unknown. I didn't know about John J. McCloy until 19 years ago when he was appointed by Lyndon Johnson to be on the Warren Commission to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. And interestingly enough, his section to investigate was the Soviet Union part, whether or not there was a conspiracy. And the Soviet Union part was the Lee and Marina Oswald working in Minsk in that Belarusis section with the Nazis and with Navy intelligence. He was given that most secret section to be in charge of and to rule out any evidence that was available and printed by the Warren Commission hearings, was not put in the Warren report but printed in the hearings. Now there's a few of his so-called accomplishments that are listed in this article. There may be even more, but I'm just quoting one article. He was the Assistant Secretary of War during World War II. He oversaw the American occupation of occupied territories in Europe and Africa and Asia after the war. That's when men like Claus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, was paid by the Americans and kept to tell who the resistance movement leaders were that hadn't yet been killed off. He oversaw the American occupation, as I say, of those countries. He drafted the plans for post-war reconstruction of Japan and Germany, which became the Trilateral Commission for Nelson, Rockefeller, and Brzezinski, and the powers that be, America, Germany, and Japan. He supervised wartime internment of the Japanese in America. That was with the California Attorney General Earl Warren. Later, Warren was to head the Warren Commission and work with Allen Dulles on the investigation of Kennedy, and with John J. McCloy and Leon Jaworski in the investigation of John Kennedy. There was a coup in Dallas in November 22nd, 1963, and the very people that have run this government since World War I were right on that commission, holding it tight, hiding their Nazi agents or Navy intelligence agents while they passed off the lie that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. He helped the Allies with their military actions, and he forestalled any effort against the Nazi death camps. The Jews, the Americans, various people went to him and wanted to bomb the railroad tracks, at least that into Auschwitz or Dachau. He wouldn't do it. He put that off, and he was against interfering with the extermination of, there were 13 million killed, just 6 million Jews, but 13 million. He was president of the World Bank after the World War, and he guided the international development for years to come on who would get money and who wouldn't get money. He was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is the David Nelson Rockefeller Standard Oil gang, and Chase Manhattan was the cover for William Stevenson, read A Man Called Intrepid. And then from there, they formed with ITT and the corporations, the organizations that would get us geared for World War III. At one time, he was chairman of the Ford Foundation. Henry Ford, of course, was one of the big people that funded Adolf Hitler before, during, and after the war, the Nazis. He's chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations that influences all government policy and major news media coming out of New York City or the West Coast, CBS, NBC, and so forth, ABC. He was chairman of the Amherst College that he graduated from, director on the board of 12 major American corporations, which are not listed here. You'd have to look them up in Who's Who. He was senior partner in prestigious law offices in New York City, and the last office he was in, they wrote fake law degrees for agents of the government, such as Hans Tuft, to do their spy work. They were given phony law degrees, and they were spies from the United States government. In 1950s, he helped articulate U.S. foreign policy through the Cold War, starting with the overthrow of Mossadegh and putting the Shah in, and then the Shah's oil money and the Pahlavi money goes back to Chase Manhattan, where he's the head of Chase Manhattan, eventually is the chairman, goes right into the Rockefeller banks, the oil profits which they took away from Great Britain and gave to America and put in the Savak. And of course, working with Nazis, the Pahlavi family were heavily involved with Nazis before and after the war, and the torturing began, the racks and the cutting off of limbs and the notorious Savak. He brought men into our government and policies. He was the guiding light behind Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger writes about him, and he writes about Fritz Kramer. So the two of them had an equal part in creating Fritz Kramer, and now they want to make a law to change the Constitution to make Fritz Kramer president. So if you want to know who's behind, not Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger. Fritz Kramer worked with John J. McCloy. He got credit for Henry Kissinger, the man behind him. John J. McCloy gets credit for creating Henry Kissinger. So Kramer and Kissinger are very close in being, as John J. McCloy designed the Pentagon, and Fritz Kramer is the plans officer for the Pentagon. They are very, very close, and their protege is Henry Kissinger. In the Constitution, there's a bill or a subject coming up now to change it so that a person not born in America could be president, and that would be Henry Kissinger, the protege of John J. McCloy and Fritz Kramer. So that's why McCloy is important. As I say, he was a member of the Warren Commission. He participated in disarmament discussions with John Kennedy. John Kennedy wanted the nuclear test ban treaty, and there are books and articles that Kennedy was murdered because one of the motives for killing him was trying to stop the Nazis at NASA, such as Mr. Dornberger and von Braun, from continuing the nuclear weapons and testing them. And incidentally, there are studies now in the London Times, the London Observer, of the testing of bombs affecting people in Great Britain. We saw what happened in Nevada and Utah, the Bikini Atolls in Australia. The people who were in the areas where the surface testing was done are all having a disproportionate amount of cancer. And these stories are other items that I didn't list, important stories on medical problems and cancer. He was allegedly helping John with disarmament, and that's when John Kennedy was giving his speech, I Am a Berliner, and getting everybody worked up on that one. He was his advisor during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was the attorney that set up OPEC, the monopoly of the oil company, of the 7 oil companies the seven sisters that got us into the bind and indebted to the oil companies with their monopoly. He was the attorney for them, and you can read about that history. It's scandalous. He urged Jimmy Carter to bring the Shah to the United States. He was instrumental in that. He's one of the people behind the scenes, and that was one of the things that caused Jimmy Carter to lose the presidency and bring in Ronald Reagan, and McCloy is still whispering behind all of their ears and advising them. Just this last week, Robert Ameo, AMEAO, the advisor to the Pahlavi Foundation, who worked with the Shah of Iran, who worked with John McCloy, was just elevated with Mr. Robert Wagner of New York to a high position in the Vatican, working with the current Auschwitz Pope. And this John McCloy worked, as I say, overthrowing Mossadegh, assisting the Pentagon, putting in the experimentation of coups, the first of a long group that returned the torture, the Nazis, and the bloodbaths, and the profits of what they drilled going to Chase Manhattan, where he worked. He was close with George Marshall. He met him during World War I, and he worked with George Patton in World War I, and those two names are important because he's again with them at the Battle of the Bulge and with the armies entering Germany, where they will rout up all of Hitler's top generals, top Nazis, including Klaus Barbie. The French only saw him for one day, and he was protected by the United States government and coddled, and as they say, could turn over the resistance leaders' names that weren't killed. He was behind the Marshall Plan in 1948, and then the World Bank would decide where the reconstruction and development would go, and the work of this bank was the job of Mr. John McCloy. He was the High Commissioner of Germany starting in 1949. Truman put him in this office, and he was a Republican. We voted Democrat into office, and here's Harry Truman in office, but the John McCloy comes in and is appointed with General Lucius Clay and works with him. Clay and Patton wanted to rearm Germany and make war with Russia, identical to what Herbert Hoover wanted. McCloy worked with them, and he became the American High Commissioner. He went over to Germany, and he ran Germany, and he retained final control over all basic policy decisions of Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer was put into power. He was married to a cousin of the Rockefellers, and John McCloy, you wonder where he ever slept at night with all of the power that he had all over the world. And as I say, I learned his name 19 years ago when Kennedy was murdered, and I started saving every article on every member of the Warren Commission. I didn't know who they were. I just started saving the articles. A lot of people call me and want to know, is the subject complicated? How do you start? You just start the day you get interested. When Kennedy was killed and Lyndon Johnson appointed a Warren Commission to investigate his murder, and he had Allen Dulles and John McCloy and Mr. Cooper and Mr. Russell from Georgia and Gerald Ford from Michigan, I began to save every article on how they voted, who they saw, who they socialized with. So I have a composite for the past 20 years of who these dogs were. And this fellow, John J. McCloy, was the High Commissioner in Germany. I didn't follow the news in those days. This was before Kennedy was killed. I really wasn't interested in the news until 1963, November 22nd. So in 1949, I wasn't so concerned. I was married, and my first son was a year old, and I was cooking and taking care of the house and the family, and couldn't care less about the High Commissioner in Germany, working with General Lucius Clay. And I didn't know that Clay loved Adolf Hitler and hated Russia and wanted war with Russia. I thought the war was over and I was going to have a family and live happily ever after. I didn't know that this was going on. So he was running Germany and had final control over what was going on over there. And then the question came up, what to do with the Nazis. Now, the question was asked of a newspaper man in an interview with Klaus Barbie, why wasn't he tried at Nuremberg? The question was asked. And the answer was he wasn't a big fish. He just killed 2,000, 4,000 resistance people, tortured them, beat them to death personally, children, women. But he wasn't important. They wanted the important ones at Nuremberg. And what did they do with them? John McCloy released them. They hung 8, and some in absentia, one of them like Martin Bormann. He released the top Nazis. John McCloy, with all of these jobs, went to Germany and rejected any idea that Mr. Morgenthau had of making it a pastoral country, an agricultural country. He rebuilt their arms just as Herbert Hoover with the Belgian relief money after World War I and after the Versailles Treaty rebuilt Germany for World War II. John McCloy built up that country, and he wanted to combine Germany with the United States against the Soviet Union. And this article goes into, it says the U.S. was increasingly concerned in transforming Germany into a partner against the Soviet Union. Now, this didn't happen in the 50s. This didn't happen in the 40s. By 1943, January 43, when Hitler could not win the Soviet Union, they all had meetings, and they retrenched, and they decided what they would do next. And that is why the same names run through these histories, and everything you read about the era weaves with the same people, the same meeting places, because they had boards, they had committees, they had their Council of Foreign Relations, they had the Opus Dei, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral, the Reverend Moonies that was put in with Hitler's money. All of these people had a time and a place and a time slot, and they all knew where to meet and how to get the next appointment or the position and remain faceless. McCloy is literally faceless to most people. So that at Nuremberg, a few died, and people like Klaus Barbie were considered absolutely nothing. They were paid by our government and given the money in 1951 to go down to Bolivia. Joseph Mengele didn't go down to Paraguay until the 50s. He was sitting around Germany at his relative's car place. Now, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau wanted the destruction of Germany, as I said, to take away the industrial capacity, but McCloy wouldn't have it. He did not want to destroy Germany. He put back the Krupps. He let them out. He put back the Tysons and so forth. He blocked Winston Churchill's plan. And this is just for one article. There's more about McCloy, but I'm just giving you one article in Harper's Magazine that has all of this in it. Winston Churchill wanted to execute top Nazi leaders. The Project Paperclip by Clarence Ladsby tells how they wanted to kill Mr. Dornberger and hang him at Nuremberg, that he should dangle and never be surfaced again, he should die. Well, Dornberger was taken by the Americans to be head of Bell Aerospace out at Dallas-Fort Worth, and Michael Payne, who housed Lee and Marina Oswald at his home, worked for Dornberger. I caught on to these Nazis studying the Kennedy murder, but they weren't hung, and McCloy went against Winston Churchill. Don't execute those Nazis, use them. Use their energy, they're anti-communist, use their connections, and Interpol was set up. It was Hitler's police force, his agency of people to keep track of, to kill. It was set up by Mr. Heydrich, the man who had the Heydrich, the final solution in Europe for how to exterminate all Jews and other people, many other people also. J. Edgar Hoover was vice president of Interpol, and he worked with McCloy straight through. So McCloy said, don't execute them, we'll use them. By 1944, the death camp knowledge was known. As I say, the Jewish leaders went to him. He refused. He said, if we bomb Auschwitz, and it was really a factory for I.G. Farben, and the Polish Pope was working there. If they bombed Auschwitz, you wouldn't have the Polish Pope right now, and Italy would be have its taxes back, maybe they wouldn't, but you wouldn't have the Auschwitz Pope who worked for I.G. Farben then, who puts Herman Apps of I.G. Farben into power now. He refused to bomb the railroad tracks. He wouldn't touch them. And then another role he had during the war was a Japanese internment. He was one of the main officials to lock up the Japanese, 127,000 Japanese on the West Coast. 2/3 of them were United States citizens. And he was working with the Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, who, as I said earlier, was headed the Warren Commission with John J. McCloy and Allen Dulles. Dulles was meeting in Switzerland with these men like Otto von Bolschwing and Mueller and Eichmann, and the whole gang of top Nazis was working with the United States during the war, before our men were freezing to death at the Battle of the Bulge. Incidentally, there was an article in the San Jose News, David Emery told me this week, about a man up in the Bay Area in Santa Clara wanting to get together with a group to discuss the Battle of the Bulge. The interesting thing was the address was in Virginia. It sounded like a little paranoid, a CIA front. Long long to be studied. The most important battle of World War II was the Battle of the Bulge, because all these people were there. And one of the things about John J. McCloy was he decided where the armies would go. He made the decision, according to this article, on where the armies would enter. He traveled with them. In 1942, he traveled with the American troops in North Africa. He was the advisor to the Pentagon. When we entered the war, he was set in there by Henry Stimson. That was Herbert Hoover's big wheel in the Pentagon, and I'll do more on that next week on Stimson. But the important thing is that John McCloy, who's the banker, the World Bank, the attorney for all the oil companies, for Chase Manhattan, in charge of rebuilding Germany, of releasing the Nazis, he helped the major campaigns. He didn't go to the War College. He went to Amherst University for undergrad, and he went to Harvard to law school. So how did he know where to enter? You see, this is a man who falls right into place when I said that Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer were right there on the Rhine in the Bulge with Mr. Patton, and then they set up their war school at Omer Ammergau with Hitler's top agents, Mr. Piper, Mr. Dietrich, and I believe Fritz Kramer, Hitler's Fritz Kramer, is our Fritz Kramer until I find otherwise, and I still pursue it every single week. They were all at that war college working together, and who was letting them off later off the hook out of the Nuremberg trial? Their leaders, their bankers like Hallmar Schacht and the top bankers and Hermann Abs and all, John J. McCloy. But he physically entered Germany in 1944 with people like General Patton, who he had been working or known since 1917, and Mr. Clark. So he was very important. Well, during the war, he was rounding up the Japanese. He was the civil affairs officer of the War Department, and he also had a very important job in deciding who entered the army and who was conscripted. Now, that's important because during the war period, there was Mr. Peter Drucker from Germany who came into the United States Army Intelligence and worked with Fritz Kramer and brought Kramer here. There was Fritz Kramer from Germany and Italy. His last stop was Italy. His wife and baby and mother were in Germany during the war. I.G. Farben, chemical family. There was Henry Kissinger, and John J. McCloy's history goes to Paris. I won't have time this week. I don't believe it. I'm going to do more about his role in Germany and in France. He was working on German espionage from World War I. That was his alleged cover. He was with Rudolf Hess. He was in Adolf Hitler's box at the Olympic Games. He was, as I say, physically entered into the area of Germany with the top Americans who were later going to control the committees and the decisions for World War III, where we are now with the going bankrupt with the missiles, the rockets, the deployments, and the weapons, and so forth. After the war, McCloy was important in turning down Jews in coming to this country. He did not want to give them compensation. He argued with Henry Stimson against Jews being brought here from the Holocaust to the United States in 1944. He wouldn't allow refugees in, and after the war, he wanted them to go to Israel, and they would give them money if they'd go to Israel, but they couldn't be here. In 1945, after he had entered the Rhine and entered Germany, in 1945, he resigned from the War Department. Harry Truman was president, and became the senior partner of Milbank, Tweed, Hope, Hadley, and McCoy. And that's where Hans Tuft, the agent, after the CIA was formed in 1946, 47, Hans Tuft, one of the top agents from Holland, was given a law degree and used it and came out of the law office of Milbank, Tweed, Hope, Hadley, and McCloy. That was in 1945. He officially left the War Department. He had been in those battles in South Africa. He had entered in Germany. In 1946, he was on the Dean Acheson Lilienthal Committee for International Control of Atomic Energy, whatever that was, control of atomic energy, at a time when John McCone left Bechtel and McCone and went to the atomic energy, where all the top Nazis in 46 from Project Paperclip were welcomed to the United States, to every major hospital, every university, every defense department installation, every place where we were to make weapons and missiles and atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs, and medical experimentations at Fort Derrick, Maryland, all German names, UCLA, various hospitals, you name it. John McCloy entered into Germany with these people. He released them. He would not stop their work during the war. He was with the banks. Chase Manhattan was funding them. And Chase Manhattan, of course, if you read Charles Hyams' book, Trading with the Enemy, or Mr. John Loftus's book on the Belarus, the Chase Manhattan and the Rockefellers and Wiesner from the OSS and later the CIA, Frank Wiesner, and Richard Nixon, all worked close together and then worked their way up. Richard Nixon, I understand this week, is starting a satellite news analysis on foreign affairs. These people just don't die. Believe me, they don't fight away. You can't kill them because they know too much. So after the war, as president of the World Bank, it was created by Bretton Woods, a monetary conference, Bretton Woods, the monetary conference, a lending agency that began giving money to 48 countries. The first president of that was Eugene Meyer from the Washington Post. He resigned in 1946. And the next successor died a few weeks later, and in 1947, John J. McCloy took over the World Bank, and he began his tentacles into who should get money from the Marshall Plan, and Mr. George Marshall and Mr. George Patton were his buddies going back to World War I. There's a strong line of bankers and of people who have worked together. Herbert Hoover, Henry Stimson. Stimson appointed McCloy to the jobs that he had in Washington. Now, next week, I'm going to do some more and complete this one article with a little historical reference to add in between of things that I know about John McCloy, but mainly to stick to this article. And if you don't have it, get it. It's Harper's. It's on the stand some places, and if you can't get it, I have some copies, and I'll have more made, and I'll send them to you at whatever the cost is to duplicate them. But this man had his fingers in designing the Pentagon. He wasn't an architect. He was the man behind Henry Kissinger, who may be president. He was the man who rounded up the Japanese and worked with Earl Warren. He covered up the Nazi connections to the John Kennedy assassination. He was instrumental with Allen Dulles of carefully concealing that. Now, in the meetings, the minutes of the meetings that David Lifton printed of the Warren Commission hearings, there was a question of whether or not to publish those 26 volumes of material, 15 volumes of testimony, or 16 volumes, and then the supporting evidence or documents in addition to the testimony. And Allen Dulles says, well, if we don't print it, they talked about burning it. Allen Dulles says, if we don't print it, somebody will think that we're covering up something, and if we print it, nobody will read it anyway. Well, that was one mistake Allen Dulles made. It's been 20 years, and people have not used it really properly, and I think one of the important things for young people who listen to this broadcast, and there are many of them who do, is that when these commissions are formed and you want to find out who's killing who and what's going on, do a biography of the people involved. In other words, say if John DeLorean, an example, and John DeLorean was arrested and Mrs. DeLorean came out with Mr. Siegel. He was the president of Chris Craft. You remember the broadcast I did? I looked up who was on the board of directors of Chris Craft. Their attorneys. And then their attorney, just Simon Rifkin, was involved with Otto von Bolschwing and the Galen spy network. In other words, when there's a commission involved or somebody's appointed or a cabinet position or an appointment, whether it's for the energy or whether it's for arms control, get the biographies of these people, what institutes they belong to, what think tanks, who else is on the board, and then you get a pretty good idea of the direction they're going to go. They don't vary that much, and that's a clue to a way to research, is to research the people appointed to find the facts, and then once you do that, you just know how many facts you're going to find out or you're not going to find out. Well, our time is up now. I'm glad the weather is nice. There's no towers down. There's no electricity off. We're communicating again, and we'll keep it up. Keep your reading going. Send me articles, and I'll share more with you next week. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.